Hello and welcome everybody to a very special presentation. I would like to introduce a couple of guests, and we're going to talk about some very interesting and important topics, well, to myself anyway, and I'm sure that there will be much to be said and further on from the initial conversations as well. So first of all, I'd like to welcome back to the podcast Mr. Bob Smith. How are you, sir?
Very fine, very fine. How are you doing today, man?
Well, I am so good, and I'm grateful for your attendance. Thank you so much for rocking in, and a very special guest for myself, who I've been following for a little while now, and I'm really enjoying getting to know this man's particular large body of works, and it is a large body of works. Very prolific commentator, presenter, teacher, author, and many things. And there's much footage of this particular gentleman available for further exploration. But without further ado, I'm going to bring forth the one and only Mr. Mark Stavish.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I will adjust the cameras in a minute so we don't look all up and down. But what I was going to say is that Mark, you've got an upcoming event which we will talk about towards the end of the conversation. But I'm just going to do a quick plug for those at the beginning to say this is the 7th annual Institute for Hermetic Studies conference coming up in early June. And this is very exciting. Obviously, this is an annual conference, and I'm just looking through the materials here, and there's lots of exciting looking topics here. Would you like to give a quick brief, and then we can cover it again towards the end of the conversation?
This is an annual conference we have here in northeastern Pennsylvania. So it's about a 3-hour drive from Syracuse, New York, Baltimore, and easy to access from the bus lines. Should you be taking a bus in from Philadelphia, New York, or someplace like that. So it's easy to get to. It's extremely affordable, and we do it by Zoom as well. We'd like to have you in person, but if you can't be there on Zoom. And once we get the video back, we post it so that we make it available to people. So say you want to be there, say you can't be there all day on Zoom. Don't worry about it. At some point, it may take us a few months because we do work with volunteers, but we're going to get that video up there for you to see and enjoy and go back to again. That's the nice thing about it. Once you have access to it, you have access to it, well, for as long as we keep it up. And that seems to be as long as we exist. So that kind of is a segue to what we're going to talk about.
Indeed.
Absolutely. I'm just going to put this question out, and I'm fairly sure that this can be squeezed down into a nutshell. But for those who maybe are vaguely unfamiliar with egregores, I'm wondering if you two gentlemen could give us a sort of a succinct sort of nutshell of that term. So Mark, could you please share with us your understanding of an egregore?
Well, it's simple. It's a social control mechanism. And of course, I pull that term from Jacques Vallée's work, Messengers of Deception. And it's a limiting factor. And that's okay. Okay. We need limiting factors to get anything done. As long as it moves us in a direction, and that direction is healthy and helpful for us. I like what Bob said about groupthink because I was at an estate sale just yesterday, and the fellow had a spectacular collection of military and intelligence information. And I picked up a monograph, a fairly hefty one of the kind that you would have gotten in the 70s and 80s, uh, on that very term, groupthink. And it's an analysis of groupthink and decision making on the national level and the strengths and weaknesses. And it goes through different scenarios with different presidents. So that's the kind of thinking that was going on for a very long time in terms of what is the process of normative thinking and what are the strengths of it and what are the weaknesses of it. And then how does that affect what we do and become? So for us as occultists, esotericists, it has to do with our spiritual practice and our capacity to experience ultimate reality. So an egregore can move us in that direction of experiencing ultimate reality, but it cannot, and it often does, becomes a substitute for it. But we cannot completely remove ourselves from them because as long as we are existing in duality, which exists on a very subtle psychic dimension as well, we're always going to be connected to someone in some way because of just the nature of what they call in Buddhism interdependent origination, or what we would call just the interconnectedness of all things. And what egregores do is they kind of limit that connection to a specific ideal, and then from an ideal to an idea, and from an idea to a expression, and then from expression to action.
Mr. Bob Smith, please.
The easiest way to look at an egregore is it's an empowered thought form. So it's a conscious thing that has energy associated to it. The most common concept or parallel in modern thought is that of groupthink, but groupthink leaves out the energetic and intelligent component of what's going on. So anytime you get more than two people together, you get an egregore. And as a result of this intelligence and energy, their behavior as a group begins to norm. This is the reason why it's very hard to pretend to be a cop or pretend to be a priest or pretend to be a lawyer. Because even if you have all of this intellectual knowledge given the subject matter, you don't necessarily have the membership card to the egregore that governs those things.
Why does knowledge of egregores matter to the forward-thinking spiritual practitioner? And when I refer to the word forward-thinking, that short term there, that phrase, I'm thinking about, these are when we're planning and we're looking forward to, this path of what we might call excellence. And so there's strategizing, and there's obviously we need to think on our feet too, but then there's a long game which we can think about. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, please. Mr. Mark Stavish.
Well, it's because occultists aren't forward thinking. They're terrible at it. 20th century and early 21st century occultists are notoriously poor planners, notoriously poor organizers, and they're a bunch of children playing at being adults. And that's pretty much it. Okay, and as harsh as that sounds, I say that after 45 years of experience in this. So when we talk about forward planning, that means that you have to start thinking about more than yourself. What is my legacy? What am I leaving for my children and grandchildren? We have right now, contemporary spiritual reality is obsessed with progressive politics. It's tearing it apart. And at the same time, it is incredibly anti-family. Now, not as much as it used to be. It used to be meaning 15, 20 years ago, but that's only because so many of the people in it got older and they rely more on the blue pill than they used to. So you're seeing that effort at family friendliness, but it never really gets off the ground. So without family, real family, genetics, there's no future. And we can go down the laundry list, I'm sure Bob and I will before this is done, of how contemporary society and contemporary esotericism reflects contemporary society. It is more molded by it than molds it. It is fundamentally on a suicide path. Now, maybe not suicide, but pretty close to it. It's on a self-destruct. And to be forward thinking is to recognize that your actions have consequences, what those actions are, then what you need to do to change it. So when we're looking at the future, again, it's what am I leaving for my children and grandchildren? Because if I truly believe in reincarnation, where am I going to come back to? You don't get to crap the bed and then get a new one. You're not a rock star. You don't get to destroy the hotel room and someone else pays the bill. But that's the working assumption. One of the things I hear from a lot of our supporters, and I've been writing about this for 15 years. I can show you articles I wrote. I did. I sent them to you from 15 years ago. And they'll always tell me something like, "Oh, well, when I die, if you're still around, if IHS is still around, I'll make sure that you get my collection, my library." Well, two things have just been said right there. One is you're worth more to me dead than you are alive.
Hmm.
Okay, that's the first thing. And you don't really care enough to make an effort now to make sure that we are around so that we can receive it.
Hmm.
That's what you've told me. So you don't really care. This is just an extension of your entertainment budget.
Hmm.
And when we get down to how many people are actually involved in this, even with all the explosions in podcasts and publishing and everything, that is not infrastructure development. That is not organizational capacity.
Mhm.
It's communication capacity. It's information outreach. It's not organizational structure. When you look at the number of people involved in this, depending on how you want to slice the numbers, it can be anywhere from 1% to maybe 1.5 and 2 of the population, or even under 1. But let's go with 1. 1 is a nice number to deal with. Okay. When you look at how many people in any of these, and I remember I've been doing this for 45 years in a lot of organizations, a lot of groups. And the one presentation, my worst attended presentation at a conference ever, was on organizational development capacity, long-term planning. Okay. So when you look at the number of people involved in the organizations that keep them alive and make them happen, it tends to be maybe about 1% of that total.
Hmm.
I mean, you talk about a leadership decapitation strike. I mean, we can be wiped out fat. It went, they talk about Night of the Long Knives. That was actually over a weekend. We'd be done in 4 hours.
Hmm.
Yep.
So to drive this point home more clearly, there is still the constant desire and infantile obsession with someone coming to our rescue and paying the bills for us. And that we're not responsible. We don't have to be responsible for the future. We don't have to plan for the future. The Space Brothers are going to do it. Kalki Avatar is going to do it. Jesus Christ is going to do it. Well, here's the thing, though. You don't have any plans for the future, but all the people who hate you do. So keep that in mind. And it's not to say, again, this notion, we do have enemies. Sometimes we're our worst enemies are within. But the fact is, if you want to create a better version of the future in which you get to play a part, you have to start now with that. You have to begin that now. Karma isn't some bank account you draw upon. Karma is a force in action right now.
Mhm.
Right now. And whether you believe in it or not doesn't really matter, because Al Qaeda, they've got a plan. Okay, name someone. Evangelicals, old Bob Larson folks, they got a plan. Catholic Church, it's got a plan. Go down the laundry list. All those undocumented gang leaders coming across the border, they got plans. If you want to survive in the future, and if you means esotericism, in a meaningful way that has an influence on what that future is going to look like, you better start getting together and realizing you need to organize and get a plan, and one that's workable and effective. Because the capacity to work together is the first sign of being an adult. And we don't see that a lot in this. I mean, when your motto is laughingly, oh, it's like herding cats, you've already said you are out of the gene pool. You do not matter. And you've taken yourself out. So once you've been able to organize and play well with others, now you have to be able to solve problems. And that problem solving is what keeps emergencies from becoming catastrophes. So I'm going to stop and let Bob pick up because I'm sure he's got a few choice words to say. And I've been being nice here, haven't I, Bob?
Very, yeah, and we're gonna get into more of that later on. Why does knowledge of egregores matter to the forward-thinking spiritual practitioner? Here's the deal, guys. When you're immersed in an egregore, it will control your behavior. Everything that goes on will appear to be completely genuine on your part. Everything will appear to be completely organic on your part. But here's the catch. It's not. It's the egregore working you. I'll give you a very good example of this. I studied with a school of St. Cyprian a couple years ago. Did all the prayers, did all the offerings, worked fantastic, by the way. I developed a sincere desire to be ordained a priest in an apostolistic line of succession. This appeared completely natural after decades of not going to church. Okay. One morning, I'm lying in bed in that state between consciousness and sleep. And there's Cyprian monkeying with my Akashic connection over my head. Okay. Well, I earned that through an internal power system. Nobody gave that to me. It was really uncomfortable, really hard. So my take is that kind of development, nothing else gets to monkey with, manipulate. So I break with the school. Horrible headaches for weeks afterwards, real pain in the ass. I could banish it away for a few hours at a time, but it would come back and it slowly got better. The second I did that, and I mean the second I broke with the school, this desire to be ordained a priest, gone. That's how I knew it wasn't me. So here's the thing. Human beings are horrible observers of their own behavior. So when you're in egregore, whether you're being a cop, being a lawyer, being a doctor, being the brand manager for Coca-Cola, you're going to be all on board with what that's about, and it's going to seem very natural. It's only once you've left that and you've broken with it that you can look at it from the outside and go, ah, this is why people are behaving the way they do. And why, even when presented with clear evidence to the contrary of what they're working on, when they're inside that thing, they can't see the evidence. Because the egregore controls your observation of reality so strongly. So, if you're an esoteric practitioner who's looking at the long term, you need to look really closely at these different groups out there and go, okay, what's really going on here? Okay. If you're signed up to a group that truly believes we're coming to an environmental catastrophe from which there is no survival, what kind of long term planning are you going to be doing? Not going to be doing anything. Most of the members of these groups don't have children either. They don't think there's going to be a tomorrow. But again, you can't see that from the inside. From the inside, it seems completely normal. It's only from the outside. So here's the thing. If you want to work with other people, you will be dealing with egregores. I'm not that smart. You're not that smart. No one's that smart. I don't have that much free will. You don't have that much free will. Nobody has enough free will where they can be inside one of these things and completely override what's happening. So, while you do have free will and the choice to join one of these things or another is ultimately yours, okay, that's absolutely true. Although society may make not joining a little painful, as some Germans around 1939 involving Nazi party membership. Once you're in that, it's really more a matter of choosing which egregore you want to be a part of rather than avoiding the phenomenon altogether. Because here's the headline, kids. Lone wolves die. Lone wolves don't leave anything behind other than a set of bones, and then the animals fight over who gets to eat them. So, from an esoteric standpoint, if you're the greatest, biggest, baddest grandmother basement practicing magus out there, good for you as an individual. Maybe good for the handful of people you engage with over the course of your lifetime. Once you're dead, everyone will forget everything about you. All the research you've done, gone. All the advancements you've made, gone. Say what you want about, Shingon Buddhism, right? They've been able to keep together a branch of magical Buddhism for 1,000 years. That's pretty damn impressive. Multiple attempts by the ruling government to weed them out and annihilate them, they're still here. In fact, the oldest operating company on the face of the planet builds temples in Japan. So, again, look at organizations very carefully, specifically the behavior of the individuals involved, what their lives are like, and what they seem to get out of it. Because if you are part of that organization long enough, you're going to be just like everybody else. Fair enough? Sorry, Phil, you're on mute again.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I'm so engaged in the conversation. I'm loving it. Thank you, gentlemen. So within these, we step into these pools, this mass of this group consciousness, or this egregore, and we are being influenced, whether we know it or not. And these things can have within them a self-fulfilling prophecy potentially as well, where this is the worldview that you adopt when you join in this thing, and maybe you're not completely on board with it as a starting point, but over time it'll permeate and sort of, you become immersed more fully in this sort of ideal. And after reading Mark's book as well, this great book, which I must say I was very surprised to find that the local library had a copy of Mark Stavish's Egregores book. I thought that was pretty damn cool. And what's funny is it was right next to the Enochian dictionary, and it was right face, like the cover was facing outwards in our little public library here. I thought that was quite very, very sweet of them. So yeah, so this thing about we've talked about being conscious of, we choose, we as practitioners, we're more aware of how our footsteps, how we step, leave footprints behind, and whether or not those footprints we leave behind are actually going to be remembered or of some value to coming generations as well. And so this is probably just going to wander off a little bit, but as far as the mediums of legacy wisdom that we have the ability to sort of leave behind, as opposed to carving stone, what do you think are the most sort of rock solid ways of recording our teachings to pass on for the betterment, so that they don't, the next generations don't have to reinvent the wheel, Mr. Stavish?
We at the Institute for Hermetic Studies, we have a teacher training program, and the purpose there is to help people learn how to teach esotericism, because you can be a fairly good practitioner, but it doesn't mean you're a good teacher. Learning how to communicate with people and deal with people where they're at is a skill set, and a skill set that has to be learned. So when you look at the organization you're joining, you have to say, well, what is it expecting from me, and what does it give to me? What's the relationship here? So if you're getting together once or twice a month to have ritual, that's wonderful. That's fine. But it doesn't mean you're going to have survival capacity with that skill, because you're not going to have the skills for it. And the skills have to do with what's called transmission.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes you see, and this is important to notice, where do we see a lot of esotericists historically have been going off and on, but more on in the last, say, 20 years, but say for the last, say, 40 or 50, but also where do we see the fastest growing Christian denomination, particularly among esotericists, Eastern Orthodoxy. Because with Eastern Orthodoxy, you get a complete set. You have an iconography, you have visual graphics, you have a liturgy, you have a culture, you have all this stuff. What's the other one? Tibetan Buddhism. Well, why? Because it's fairly accessible. It's a complete set. It has both inner and outer practices and all this other stuff. So the irony is, we see a lot of teachers in Western esotericism claiming their legitimacy from their Vajrayana teachings or from their Orthodox Christian ordinations. Well, if that's the case, why don't I just join one or the other? So to build structure means to build up the person and the persons involved in the organization. And that means capacity, how to run a group. That's why historically, you look at all the organizations that did last long in the West, and I stress in the West, they had a lot of very successful people in them because you had to be successful enough to be able to carve out enough time to go join and participate. Whereas in the East, and we'll mean what? Everything from India over that we're familiar with, these were essentially either state sponsored through taxation. I mean, look at Tibet, it was a feudal medieval empire. Those temples were supported through serfdom. This is what's not understood. You look at the massive temples in India, they're still supported through either various forms of taxation or through massive donations. And we don't have a culture where generosity and donations are seen as important or part of one's spiritual path, at least not in the esoteric domain. In fact, it's discouraged and actively considered by many to be just, money grubbing. Oh, well, yeah. Well, what are you leaving behind? Nothing. What are you doing to help others? Yeah, nothing. So the organizations then require the generosity of the individuals involved, which is a dramatic difference between a lot of Eastern and Western esoteric events or structures. And I think with that as well, something to keep in mind. And I've had a big disagreement with people on this. They said, well, even the monks used to, bake their bread and sell their beer. Yeah, that's not completely true. The monks owned the property around the monasteries, and the farmers had to use their equipment in order to grind their wheat or sell them the product. So those monasteries were major corporations. Now, they had a social purpose, and that social purpose was, again, holding the society together. But let's not pretend that these were just, laboring hermits. They weren't. And the best and brightest of them weren't out there making bread. They were called off to do the manuscripts and the other stuff. So we essentially, in Western esotericism, have delusions and fantasies about how this whole thing works and runs and the history of it. It really is just drawn out of comic books and entertainment. And to get to survival mechanism, long-term planning mechanism, is going to require that we get incredibly honest with ourselves, not only about our past, but why we're in it, what we expect from it, and what we're willing to give to it, and what we want for it and for ourselves for the future. Because again, if you believe in reincarnation, where are you going to get these teachings in the future if you don't build a structure for them to be here now? You don't just get to show up again and say, well, I'm here. Good, get to the back of the line.
Thank you. Yes, these are important considerations because I can speak from my own experience in a slightly unrelated way. Is that I became a better musician from becoming a music teacher, and I took on an air of responsibility about how I conducted myself because I had these young impressionable minds in front of me. And I recall a quote that somebody gave me, or a question, a contemplation, where somebody said, "Well, if you were dropped into the middle of the jungle by yourself and in survival mode, you'd it would be very different than if you were dropped in with with a bunch of young people, a scout group, and you were the oldest, and you were there to ensure their survival. Essentially, there's an essence of yourself that arises where other things are put aside, and you become quite focused. And so, this idea of going, well, I want to leave something solid behind, and I want to. I just speaking from personal experience here. But Bob, I would love to hear your thoughts about this conversation about mediums of
Sure.
recorded transmissions and such.
Okay. Um, Here's the thing: is you talk to the Tibetans, you ask them who's better, the yogis or the lamas. They'll be direct with you. The yogis, they spend all day long practicing, but the teachings only get preserved because of the lamas.
Mm.
Listen, and I've said this before in other places. Why did I come forward with the 60 skills curriculum? Why did I go through all the effort to build it, considering my professional background and how embarrassing and counterproductive this is and everything else? Because the next time I reincarnate, I don't want to have to spend 30 years figuring it out all over again. Not when I've had students do it in 2.5 years. This isn't all, me being generous with people. This is a very practical problem that Mark just pointed out that has to be solved. And what's my mechanism for that? It's called a trust. When I die, all of my teachings are going into a trust. And all of the money earned from selling the videos and the books and all the rest of that goes to power the trust. So it's out there. Because here's a news flash that goes into what we talked about earlier. Yeah, we're in the midst of a Hermetics revival right now. It's awesome. History says this is not going to last. History says governments, religions, societies, sometimes they're okay with this stuff being out there. A lot of times they're not. Now, I'm not saying we're going back to 1939 when the Nazis are intentionally hunting Franz Barden anytime soon. Okay. But think about it. The only thing that would need to happen is an executive at YouTube could wake up one morning and go, you know what? This meditation stuff, doesn't really fit the brand. We want to be more of an ABC, CBS kind of, programmed content kind of creator. All you guys run along. And then that guy goes to a meeting, Egregores again, with his buddy over at TikTok and his buddy over at Meta and his friend over at Rumble that he doesn't talk about openly with anybody else. They all kind of reach an accord that, isn't really making money for the brands. It's eating up a lot of server space. Boom. Okay. Then the guy at Google goes and talks to his buddy at DuckDuckGo. We're trying to maximize earnings off of hits on web page searches. So now you just lost your media provider. And now you just lost the ability of anybody to find out who the hell you are. And this isn't a conspiracy. This isn't anybody gathering in dark rooms. Just guys going, economically, it doesn't really work for us. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it'll be very easy to happen.
Well, let me just follow up on that.
Yeah.
Uh, the only reason any kind of organized esotericism survives in Europe is because it survived in America. And as much as the Europeans hated what Amorc was doing, Rosicrucian Order Amorc in San Jose, California, as much as they hated what they were doing, they sure wanted a slice of it afterwards when that meant money to rebuild. Now, who is Amorc? Raise your hand if you don't know who they are. Yeah, Amorc was probably the single most significant esoteric organization of the 20th century. And it imploded around 1990, 92, 93. and was never able to regain its status. Now, they still exist and they have things that they do, but it is not anywhere near what it was.
Mhm.
And why I bring that up is because there are people who don't know who it is or what it was. It's as if it never existed. I've talked to people who are witches and have no idea who Sibylline was.
Hey, listen, I say it all the time. The most important book John Michael Greer ever wrote was Inside a Magical Lodge.
Hmm?
That's where I was introduced to the concept of an egregore in the first place, because it's kind of important in that context.
Yeah.
But listen, you go to Asia, thanks to state support, community support, you've got religious organizations that are, in some cases, close to 2,000 years old in some of the Buddhist lineages. We have nothing approaching that anywhere in the West. Even the Catholic Church, you can argue, is really only as old as the rise of Protestantism, 500-600 years. I've spent 30 years of my life reconstructing internal power systems of meditative development that have not changed since the time of the Egyptians. Why should this have taken me 30 years to figure out? You've seen the technology, Phil. None of it's that hard. It takes a lot of effort, but the actual technology involved is pretty primitive. And I got lucky. I have poor bastards run across my doorstep every day of the week who've been practicing longer than me, going, thank God you finally showed up. And I owe all of this to a chance meeting of Mark Rasmus in the middle of the mid Atlantic 10 years ago. Vegas wouldn't take odds on that happening. So, yeah, if you want any of this stuff to survive with any degree of certainty, economics is a force of nature. You have to pay attention to that, and you have to build infrastructure. And that means bodies and buildings and money and hardbound copies of books on acid-free paper, so on and so on and so on. Digital backups of everything. But I talk to people about this kind of stuff, and they look at me like I've got a hole in my head.
Yeah, I mean it's right up there as being as sexy as raising money for the urinals in the new building. Um,
Yes.
and which is where I'll donate my money because when anybody stands there, they're going to read in the plate with my name on it. Yeah, this is this is a reality that really, and I think Bob can tell you, I'm holding back here. This is serious. Um, when the communists came to power, they shut down all the Martinist and Masonic and Rosicrucian lodges. Um, when the Nazis came to power, they began to shut them down too. And then with Action Hess in 1940, they went more after them, although that had some different results. But in the end, they were shut down. And even though Barden survived being in a concentration camp, which was no small feat, ultimately he did die in custody of the communist secret police. So um, at the end of the day, when you look at what happened with the communists in Tibet, I mean, I've talked to lamas that say, there were 3,000 monks in that temple.
Mm-hmm.
They're gone. They're all gone. Maybe a few hundred left, but the rest are now digging ditches to survive. So when we look at infrastructure, there's a lot of ways to look at it. And let me tell you some of the myths. The myth is that having it in your house is preservation. It's not. It's going to get sold off at an estate sale for $1 or $2 a book, maybe. It may go moldy over time because it's ignored, and it may eventually just get thrown in the dumpster. I've seen 2 significant libraries dumpstered, 2 of them. You are going to leave it to the library. No, the libraries don't want it. There are significant occult collections and university holdings in this country. They're amazing. I've seen them. But generally speaking, they don't want your stuff. Even the good stuff that you've got, they don't want. They're going to sell it off at a couple bucks a book off the cart in the front of the building. That's what's going to happen to it if they take it. So if you want to make a significant donation, you need to make you need to develop a relationship with the special collections person at whatever university is going to take it, and you have to be able to give them money for that. Or you could run the risk of donating it to your local Masonic lodge, which is not a good thing to do. That you might as well just dumpster it most of the time there. So, and I'm not being sarcastic, I'm being serious. So instead, you donate it to maybe the Grand Lodge. Now, there you're going to have money and resources, and it'll probably stay intact, but not many people are going to have access to it. It's going to get locked up more or less because people aren't going to be there. So if you want to have your collection intact or relatively intact, at least the good stuff, and preserved and accessible by the general public of interested, because we're assuming that there's an expansion going on, a potential expansion of interest. You want it there to keep that expansion going further. It's going to cost you money. And you're going to have to get involved with other people and decide how to do that. Now, we've got a plan in place. So you can talk to us, but it's not an easy one. It's not a cheap one. And that's just all there is to it because we're talking about changing the course of the future here. We're looking at a world that is on the edge of self-destructing. I mean, even if we just look at the population arc, we're going to look at probably, what is it, a 30% drop in population by the end of the century. Could be as much as half, depending on how things go. What does that mean in terms of sustaining a technological society? And for this, you need a literate society. Esotericism requires literacy, and it requires a certain high degree of education or fair degree of education. Okay? That takes real planning and effort and vision. Now, and if you don't do that, that's okay. But then don't complain when you reincarnate in a hell realm.
I would say the following. Every developed society in the world right now is looking at a severe contraction of population based off birth rates. This is going to happen. Now, how long it goes on for depends on a whole bunch of other factors. But at a minimum, over the next 30 to 50 years, you're going to see a significant contraction in those populations. All right. This goes back to esotericists not liking to pay attention to finance or economics 101. Human beings make capital. AI doesn't make capital. A robot doesn't make capital. Human beings make capital. Now, AI and robots allow human beings to make more capital than they would if they were, shucking corn on a street corner. Fair enough. But with a shrinking population comes contracting capital. Capital becomes very expensive. People become very choosy about what they're going to spend that capital on. Which means if you want to set up an organization to preserve this kind of stuff, which all of us here seem to think is a good idea, the capital to do that with is going to become increasingly difficult to get your hands on over the next 30 to 50 year period, if not longer. Governments are going to want to get their hands on any capital that they consider being applied to something non-essential. And let me tell you, there's nothing less non-essential to a government than esoterica. Again, this isn't conspiracy theory land, guys. You're going into a capital constrained environment. Governments need capital to do things with. They're going to get very creative on where they get that from. So if you think leaving $10,000 in your, will is going to allow your lifelong collection of, Peruvian papyrus scrolls that you managed to salvage from someplace. Think again. It's going to take real effort, and most people aren't capable of doing that. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be increasingly expensive as governments get desperate to get their hands on money. And listen, I've been complaining about this for 20 years, since I lived in mainland China. Hopped on my three-wheel Chanjiang motorcycle, which is a knockoff of a Soviet motorcycle, which is a knockoff of a 1941 model Wehrmacht three-wheel sidecar motorcycle. Would tear off into the countryside. In a mere 30 miles outside Beijing, I'm in villages that are filled with old people and a handful of little kids. Everybody else is gone. That was 20 years ago. They are bulldozing housing in Germany as we speak in small towns in the interior to hide the population collapse. In Japan, they are giving away houses for the cost of back taxes in the interior. I had a friend who was there recently, going through the interior, looking at some temples. Village after village, handful of old people there, all the shops closed. This is not a myth. This is happening. And it's happening because, let's go back to Egregores. We had a group of wackos under a guy named Malthus a couple hundred years ago who convinced the world that there were too many people, none of which was true, that everybody was going to starve to death, none of which happened. Now, there were great efforts that took place that prevented that from happening. Most important human being to ever walk the face of the earth. You can put 10 people up against a wall, put 6 on one side, 4 on the other. Those 6 are alive. There's one man, Norman Borlaug. How many people here have even heard that name? I know Mark has. He's the inventor of modern agriculture. He's the reason why a farm today makes 60x times the amount of grain that it did in 1945. One guy. My point being, we've programmed a couple generations of people to think there are too many people on the earth. So guess what happened? They quit having kids. Okay. All the capital that makes the modern world operate came off of a robust population. 70% of pregnancies in Eastern Europe end in abortion. How does a population survive that? It doesn't. And that's one of the nicer numbers I can give you.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that, when we look at the predictions of the Kali Yuga, it says people get stupid, and they are. The current generation is, and this is just old man talking. They're stupid. The teachings that we give often dealing with people are remedial compared to what we were teaching 30 and 40 years ago. Not only is there not a perspective on the past, the recent past, but we're doing what is essentially remedial education, not only in colleges, because I've taught at the university level, we're doing remedial education in the universities, but we're doing remedial education in esotericism. That's not a sustainable culture. That's not a functional society. That's a society getting ready to collapse. To tag on to what Bob has said, I have tremendous amount of people who keep telling me, we can do all this organic gardening and agriculture and all stuff, and said, no, you're basically going to be subsistence level.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so which means you're going to go back to a medieval structure like that. Now, should this occur, all these political ideals that have so infiltrated Western new and emerging religions, they're going to be vaporized on the spot, because those are that's urban excess. That's what happens in urban decadence and wealth. They're not sustained or tolerated in a survival situation. Rural societies are traditionally more religious and more robust, but that also means the focus is more on survival, and that means a decrease in this individualism that we have come to love and worship. So you've got to bring something serious to the table to be in that situation and survive and be a part of it. So the good thing is to try and avoid that. And the way you try and avoid that is work for an alternate vision of the future in which we get to survive and prosper, but that requires personal responsibility. And that's going to require real effort and cost and sacrifice. And there are a lot of folks out there in the last few years that I've talked to, pretty high up on the food chain, who their vision of the future is quite unpleasant. And the horizon is closer than we'd like to think. So what do you do then? Well, you can't panic. You plan, you act, and you hope for the best. But hope itself isn't a strategy. You hope for the best based on what you've done. And we can't drive this home enough. If people knew the conversations I've had with people, or Bob has had with people, we've had with each other, they wouldn't get out of bed.
So let
Yeah.
me put this into perspective a little bit for some of our viewers out there. And I'll say this because I know Mark is quite humble. I know for a fact operatives in DC who are high level in political branding take his book, Egregores, really seriously. Because if you're a branding expert and you're even just a little open minded, the concept of an egregore explains a whole hell of a lot really fast. Well, it should, it reflects reality. I don't like talking about myself a whole lot because it's generally not very productive, but this time I'll make an exception. I was at war for 18 years. I was in over half a dozen conflicts, only two of which most people watching this would be familiar with. I've seen what happens when societies fall apart. I've seen what happens when societies try to dig themselves back out of the dirt. I've worked in countries like Niger, which is one of the least developed countries on the face of the planet, by the way, and that's a UN rating. That's not me saying. Okay. All of this free capital, this excess of material wealth that we have as a result of globalism and a growing population in the form of the baby boomers, and at the time, what was a very welcoming regulatory environment that made it very easy to do things, and a very homogenous population that made reaching accord in decisions super easy. Unparalleled in human history, by far. Which is why, for literally 80 years of US economic development, if you just bought a house and threw some money into an index fund and left it in there, 30 years later, you were going to be rich. That doesn't normally happen in the description of human history. And I'm not saying that as something that happened hundreds of years ago. You could be the smartest guy on the face of the planet in Kandahar. You can be the most forward thinking guy on the face of the planet in Kandahar. And if you were born there in 1950 and you weren't able to leave, you weren't going to get anything done, no matter what you did, because the environment there wasn't going to allow you to do that. That's the reason why economic development in human beings from the time we have been able to track it about 7,000 years ago in 1100 AD was basically flat. because the circumstances of society didn't allow you to invest in infrastructure and have it survive. I'm not saying we're going back to that, okay? But what I'm saying is if the only people who survive because they have children are people from deeply religious environments, okay? Generally, a lot of stuff that goes on with esotericism is looked down on those communities. And it's looked down on those communities for very good reasons, by the way, that we can get to later on in this discussion. That's going to be a hard environment for the Institute for Hermetic Studies to survive in. That's going to be a hard environment for the 60 Skills Trust to survive in. That's what we're trying to head off at the pass here, guys. And if you think I'm being hysterical, if the rate of reproduction stays the same, doesn't change, just stays the same in South Korea, for every 100 South Koreans you have today, you will have 4 within 100 years. The plague didn't wipe out this many people. That's the environment we're going into.
But and with that is something that I find very problematic, and I think that your experience supports this. When you look at societies on decline, the average, what I have found that the average person, and that involves esotericists, has a terrible historical lexicon. Their vocabulary for history is terrible. And the perfect example is that meme that goes around. If you want to understand what's going on in America today, look at Germany in the 30s. That's utter nonsense. If you want to understand what was going on in Germany in the 30s, you need to look at the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War set back European infrastructure, Central European infrastructure, 200 years. You know, if you want to understand what was going on in the 30s, you need to look at the German reunification or unification in the 1870. You've got to look at how that affected the empire building in the First World War. You have to look at that atrocious thing known as the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles guaranteed World War II. And most of these folks have no concept of what social decay looks like, because the situation was so terrible in Germany in the 20s with no central government. Mm-hmm. That's what gave rise to the Freikorps. The Freikorps was fighting in the East against the Bolsheviks, and also a nasty little thing known as the First, Second, and Third Silesian insurrections or revolts. Now, how did that come to an end? Well, it came to an end with the French and the British, which were in strong disagreement about what to do about it. But it was fundamentally over because the German population controlled the urban areas. The Polish-speaking population controlled the rural areas mostly. And it was over natural resources. Who was going to control the mines? Who was going to control all that stuff? And of course, the British were the only ones telling the French, hey, you know, if we give it all to the Poles, that's fine, but then the Germans won't be able to run their industry and they won't be able to pay off the war debt. You know, that we've crushed them with financially. So all of these things play together. It's not just looking at the picture of 1932 when Hitler comes on stage fully formed and thinking that suddenly you know something, because you don't. These things have an arc that takes place over generations, or at least decades, and then sometimes even centuries. But each point along the way, there was an opportunity to make a choice for something, I'll say, better. Better meaning more peaceful, less violent, less destructive to the society. I mean, no one, because there's this again, what we see on the social media, this obsession with Nazism as if they know anything. You know, is you could have taken your average German in 1914, right before August, and would you say to them that, in 5 years your country's going to be defeated on the battle? Well, they weren't militarily defeated, but you're going to be defeated and at the same time crushed economically, and that 20 years from now you'll be on your way to a powerful economy and dominating all of Europe. And 30 years from now, you're going to be in ruins, complete and utter occupation. And then 40 years from now, at least the Western half is going to be an economic powerhouse of Europe. It's like, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. So the constant notion that this can't happen here or it won't because I don't want it to or because I don't want to think about it, is it just going back to the need to really reassess why we're in this at all. What is community, and what is my responsibility to my family? What is my responsibility to my family and to my community and to the people around me? And even maybe we can further that out into a regional area, because that's going to be, as this capital constriction takes place. The age of Aquarius, they all talk about it. Saturn rules Aquarius, and that's constriction. It is going to be, everything is going to get real expensiver faster. And the only way you're going to be able to deal with it is if you can learn how to share, which means play well with others. Organize and play well with others, because you're going to have to share stuff. You're going to have to learn how to do communalism, which means voluntary coming together for societies to share and to grow. You're going to have to do that. And if you don't, you're going to die alone. And that's it. We don't make up these rules, but this is what you learn when you study history. And anyone who hasn't seen a society in collapse, you don't want to. This is what annoys the crap out of me about the media. You look at what the violence that took place between neighbors during those Silesian insurrections, where rape and sexual mutilation is a weapon of war. You look at the civil war in Yugoslavia. You look at the border wars in Kansas prior to and during the American Civil War. You look even at, most people don't know, the American Revolution was essentially a civil war. The Yankee Pennamite War, there were 3 of them around here where I live. 3 civil wars for control of this. And then there was the expulsion of the Tories, which you're not conveniently told about. But the Tories who supported it, a lot of them were thrown out, a lot of them forcibly. And there was just terrible things done, and not including the border wars and the border fighting with the French and Indian War and further west. Civil disturbance, civil destruction is something you do not want to see, because digging out of that is not something that is done easily. And it just scars things for generations.
On a more basic level, when capital gets expensive, nice to do things like taking care of your elderly neighbor who's single don't happen. Going into the hospital for a procedure that could extend an 80-year-old man's life another 10 years don't happen, because he's not going to be able to pay that back. There's a whole bunch of bad stuff that happens as a result of this. That, again, the cheerleaders for this Malthusian movement absolutely won't go anywhere near, let alone own. I mean, right now, this is me putting on a slightly different hat than I normally wear with this audience, and I'm not going to put it on very often. We're in a unique period where, to be an independent country, you only need to do one of 3 things: defend yourself, feed yourself, fuel yourself. Traditionally, you have to do all 3, or either you belong to somebody else or you don't exist at all. Well, globalism that allows this to transpire because you've got freedom of movement across the seas and worldwide freedom of movement of goods, even to competitors like the Russians and the Chinese. That's strictly the result of the United States being able to afford an 11 supercarrier Navy fleet. The second that doesn't happen, worldwide trade grinds to a halt. Because now it's just easier to steal your neighbor's stuff than to pay for it. And now we're back to 1928 on the high seas. And now we're back to a scenario where a lot of countries who can't feed themselves but could get it through trade now can't feed themselves. The only thing it would take to deindustrialize all of mainland China is for the Indians. Notice I didn't say the Americans, I didn't say the Japanese, I didn't say the Brits, I didn't say the French. Would be for the Indians to stop every oil tanker headed to the PRC from the Middle East for about 6 weeks. China would deindustrialize in 6 weeks. That's how fragile globalism is. The computer chip in this lovely iPhone 14 Pro Max that I use requires subcomponents from 4,000 different places worldwide. If you don't have freedom of movement on the seas, because nobody can afford the Navy to make that happen, guess what you don't get? And this isn't conspiracy theory talk. This is mainline transnational logistics. This is a fact. So yeah, there's everybody out there is like, oh, we want the world to be smaller, fewer people, people are bad, blah, 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 blah. What those same people don't understand is that the esotericism they enjoy and the products in their home only exist because of that robust population that can afford to do things like police the seas. That's it. Full stop.
Which kind of brings us to further elaborate on your point earlier about, or question earlier about preservation. I know people who've insisted to me that electronics is the way to go, it's the way of the future, and I keep saying no. It's great for storage, it's not that great for retrieval. And anyone who's tried to find stuff on their own laptop knows what that's like. You know you've got it there, but for whatever reason, the file pathway is corrupted, and you have to go in through some other way to find it. Books, they say, well, they don't last, or they can be destroyed or mold. I said, yeah, but you take care of them. And if you have at least some archival paper or some quality of that, they will last. So now you have to be very selective in what survives. And we have some very good books that are not on good paper, that we have to make sure we get them on survivable paper. But of course, we know there's probably about 80% of the books we could go to at Barnes and Nobles right now, randomly take them off the shelf, or at least 50% of them randomly off the shelf, burn them on the spot, and no one would ever notice, because it's not part of a tradition, it's not part of a system, it's not part of a culture, it's part of an entertainment industry, which is publishing. It's an infotainment industry whose design is to create more product and for you to consume more product. Now that's okay, but that's what's been set up, and just accept that. So if you want this to survive, you're going to have to start identifying which of the materials are most important to you for survival, and how you're going to take care of them, and how you're going to make that happen over time. And that time is going to be 50 years, maybe 100.
Yeah.
You have to plan now for 50 to 100 years. Because if you don't, trust me, the other people have.
Yeah.
And if the gods help those who help themselves. If you're not helping yourself, you don't have any right then to cry out, "Oh, help me, help me, help me." Well, you didn't do anything when you could.
But it's also not helped by factionalism. Listen,
Right.
Why has a lot of esoteric Buddhism survived? Well, culturally, they have these things called commentaries. The original book got reduced to mummy dust 1600 years ago, but somebody wrote a commentary. And systemically, the way this is set up is you reproduce the original text, you write your commentary in a different colored ink, so they know it's Joe Blogg's commentary on it. And then the next guy does that. You know what happened in the Barden community when Ray Del Sol tried to do that with IIH? Barden's family sued him. No commentaries for you. So, how is any of that going to survive? It's not. It's absolutely not. A walk in who actually wrote a book and gave a technology that could actually be repeated by somebody who's not a walk in. So, let me tell you, having worked with a couple of these guys, most of them can't give you what they have. They don't know how. One of two lines of books, well, three, that came out of the 20th or near 20th century that are worth having: Golden Dawn Technology, IIH, and Path Notes of an American Ninja Master by Glenn Morris, who described how to go through the Kundalini awakening using the macrocosmic orbits. He doesn't have an association either. His stuff isn't going to survive. The three most important esoteric works of the 20th and near 20th century could fit on a couple hundred pages of paper. None of those have an organization behind them. What are the odds any of them are going to survive 150 years from now? Very, very, very low. Because historically, trained historian, a lot of ancient Greek works and Roman works, which aren't really that old when you look at it, we only know about through secondhand descriptions. Because some Roman or Greek scholar wrote about it and mentioned the work and gave us the highlights or a passage from it. Structure, foundations, building your own temples, setting up your own trust, paying attention to the economics. This is how this stuff works, or more to the point, as Marcus pointed out, how it generally doesn't work.
I've also observed, if I may just jump in, that I've seen trends in generational forgetfulness
Yeah.
and the forgetting of things that we all remember, but newer generations forget. You know, case in point, I'm up on the stage at a school, I'm playing Guess This Song with the kids, and they go, "Oh, that's, you know, I'm playing Sweet Home Alabama," but the only reference point they have is the hook that I'm playing, but it's been covered by a newer artist, and they have, like, when they hear that hook, that familiar thing, they only think about the most recent thing that they've heard. It's like, you know, the Monkey song, I'm a Believer, you know, like it was written by Neil Diamond, but most people who've heard that didn't recognize that. And so there's this kind of thing where, you know, unless we have, but people got to want to search too. Like, I didn't want to know about blues and jazz until I really started taking my music seriously. I wanted to go back further and further and further to find out what the sources were so I could get a better understanding. And you know, and so this is just leads me to the point now. I was like, what opportunities do we have based on what we've seen before about how we can at least get a little bit, you know, put some better legs on these things that we're trying to maintain and preserve, given the current uh, methods and tech and teaching approaches. And Mark, you know, you raised a beautiful point before about, you know, IHS, the Hermetic Studies Institute, you know, having a teachers program. I've worked with teachers, I've trained teachers, I've trained trainers, and you know, there's a certain cut of the jib, I think, that people naturally have, but then there's also things that they need to onboard within themselves to maintain a level of diligence, sincerity in their strivances and earnestness towards being as effective as they can at preserving. Anyway, sorry, I am waffling here, but I'd love to hear some commentary on that.
Well, okay, I can speak from my perspective. A lot of people go, man, you have a really good way of distilling a proper point and all this other kind of business. Okay. I was in the military for over 20 years, where the second you learn how to do something, you have to teach the next guy how to do it because there's a continual replacement of personnel. I'm not good at doing ad hoc instruction by nature. I'm good at it because I got taught how to do it, and people yelled at me and held me accountable when I did it wrong. Hey, this guy can't do this. What the hell is going on? Okay. That, as Marcus pointed out, a lot of good practitioners are very lazy. They just practiced a lot. They don't know how they can do anything they do. They don't know how any of it fits together. They don't know how to stack any of it. They don't know what the important techniques are from the unimportant techniques. I got no idea. Never even bothered thinking about it because it was so easy for them to create an audience and make a living. So they didn't have to be very good. Good for them as an individual, right? But now, if you want to be serious about something, you're limiting your audience to the people who have the resources and capital to spend large amounts of time working on this stuff. That's always going to be a small group of people. Listen, why do most people know about the Golden Dawn? Aleister Crowley. Spoiled, rich kid, drug addict, who, as far as I know, never worked a real job a day in his life. And died broke, by the way. If Crowley hadn't just wandered into whatever his inheritance in hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds, none of that stuff probably would have been popularized. All of the founders of the Golden Dawn were late 19th century noblemen. They had the time and money to hang around and monkey around with this stuff all day long. They were rich and bored. Okay. That's not that many people out there. Interesting fact, number of people worldwide in the ultra high net worth category worth $20 million or more in today's dollars. There's 850,000 of them. That's it. So if a system requires full-time practice to be proficient at it, which means you can't hold a real job, then there has to be a temple or a structure or a schoolhouse or a something for that person to exist in, or it doesn't happen. Economics, Mark.
When we look at this, it's really very easy to become negative about it because we're not used to problem solving in this field. We're used to being told that this stuff is going to solve our problems and make them go away. So we have to start being realistic about what we can expect from it and what it expects from us. And that being said, the best thing to do is to meet up with other people and start getting uh, regularly engaged in the process of just finding ways to do work with others in this field. That's the first thing. Now, it's best if you could join an existing group or organization, and it would be nice if they were healthy. But at the same time, it depends on what your goals are. So if your goals are for the preservation and expansion of this material, and you define what this material is, define what the curriculum might be. What are the top 100 books? What are the top 500 books? What are the top 1,000 books? And have them in a list and in relationship to one another, why they're important. Why does this matter? And write this up as a document and begin to share this with people and talk about the future. The thing is, you have to bring the question up and talk about it before you have to recognize that it's there. It has to be brought to the threshold of consciousness before you can do anything about it. And then you have to believe that it's important. And of course, the only way I believe we can make people understand it's important is from approaching their selfishness. Because that's why many are involved in esotericism to begin with. They're selfish. They want their problems to go away. They don't really deal with them. They want to magically make them vaporize. So the selfishness is okay. You believe in reincarnation. Here we go again. Yes, I do. Okay, well then, where are you going to get this information from? How is it going to be there? Hope is not a strategy. Hope is great to have. It's positive. We have to hope for things, but we have to have a strategy that goes with it. So begin with talking, begin with engaging with other people, and make it something serious. Now, you may be able to work with the university holdings and get 50, 100, 200 titles nestled into the holdings really nicely. That may be great. You may be able to do it with your local historical society. You may be able to do it with different lodges, Masonic Lodge in your area or a Grand Lodge. But you also have to start moving in the idea of what are we building? What is the network that we're building with other people in our region, in our community, and elsewhere? That's really the only way to do it. It's like how everyone else does it. Don't need to reinvent the wheel here. You just have to go with what works.
I'll make it even simpler than that. Um, what I would say is there are these things out there called friends. You have mutual interests. It's really easy to talk to friends on the other side of the planet now. Yet you might want to create a mechanism by which you can get together permanently. Just a thought. So the good news is, and again, we went a little dark here earlier. It's never been easier to organize this stuff. It's never been easier to protect your intellectual property. It's never been easier to find that one person in 100,000 who, for some God cursed reason, is stupid enough to be interested in this stuff. Take advantage of that. Take advantage of it. That's what I tell most people. And you might be surprised at what you get. Because here's the upshot: when societies get older, they get more concerned about their spiritual advancement. There you go. So the door is open. People just need to walk through it.
Yeah, that's it. Maybe that's why it's so frustrating is because it's really not that difficult or complex. It really we have a great window of opportunity to do so much.
And listen, there's going to be a massive turnover of capital throughout the developed world as the baby boomers die over the next 10 years. So if you know an older esotericist who wants to preserve what they're doing, hey man, this is the golden opportunity to do that. After that, it's going to get a lot harder.
Yeah, so many wonderful and important points there. Gentlemen, I'm so grateful for you both joining me today, and absolute pleasure, of course, first time connection with Mr. Mark Stavish. And I just want to say that, let's do another plug for the conference that's coming up, because you'll be able to connect with many other people. And this is a great opportunity for community connection too. So I'm just going to pull this up. Okay. So tell us, give us another recap, if you could, please, Mr. Mark Stavish.
The Institute for Hermetic Studies, our 7th annual conference on June 1st and 2nd at the Hilton Garden Inn in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Approximately 2.5 to 3 hours from all points major in the Mid-Atlantic states region. So if you're in New York, New Jersey, Delaware, upstate New York, Syracuse, even Boston can be done in 5 hours, depending on how you drive it. And of course, Baltimore, DC, 3.5 to 4 hours. We're right there. It's a great event. It will be available on Zoom, so we will be doing it virtually as well for folks, and recordings of it will be made available after the fact for people who weren't able to be there or maybe couldn't sit through the whole event, because it is a long day. And it'll be there for you to watch. It'll be there as long as we are there.
Wonderful. And I see that the contact points, there is an email address here, info@hermeticinstitute.org, and teachable.com. I presume there is a searchable term that people can punch into that website to find it, with a QR code there as well. So, gentlemen, thank you once again. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor. I appreciate you both so much, and many, many valuable teachings in this session. And I just want to say thank you to everyone watching, and please make sure you go and check out the offerings here at the Institute for Hermetic Studies. And I will put links to that in the description below, as well as, of course, to 60skills.com.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that Bugatti is not going to pay for itself. So
This is it. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
cheers, guys.
Have a wonderful one. Bye-bye.